Hello, fifth graders. Today we're going to continue reading We're Writing the Constitution by Jean Fritz. Last week we read several pages and we found out how difficult it was for all the delegates to agree on what should be in our new Constitution. So today we're going to start on page 30 and find out what happened after they did come up with the Great Compromise. It was such a relief to have this settled that the convention appointed a committee of 5 to put the resolutions in order and make a document that would read like a constitution. Then the delegates voted themselves a 10-day vacation from July 26 to August 6. George Washington went fishing and caught a mess of perch near Trenton. It was a welcome diversion. Still, as always, he was homesick for Mount Vernon. He had written home earlier that he wouldn't be back before harvest, and God knows how long it may be after. He wanted the honeysuckle against the house nailed up. "Have you thinned out the carrots?" he asked. Page 31. 6 weeks of work still lay ahead after the convention reassembled. Throughout the discussions, there had been trouble not only between the large states and the small states, but between the northern states and the southern states. The southern states worried about their trade. Since the House of Representatives was dominated by northern states where more people lived, would it be fair to the South? The House had the power to tax what was sold and sent out of the states and to tax what was brought into the states. So what would happen to tobacco, rice, and indigo grown in the South and sold abroad? What would happen to slaves brought into the South? Would the North try to get rid of slavery altogether? Some Northern delegates were quick to say that was exactly what they wanted, but some Southern delegates were just as quick to say that they wouldn't belong to a government that dictated their private business. It was clear that if they wanted a constitution, the North and South would have to strike a bargain. So the northern states agreed to continue the slave trade until 1808, and the southern states agreed to give up their demand that commercial regulations had to be passed by a 2/3 vote of both houses. In addition, no one would have to pay more than $10 tax on a slave brought into the country. And there were other questions. Where would the government be located? New York? Philadelphia? A special district should be set aside, they said, not more than 10 miles square. But since they couldn't decide where it should be, they decided to let the new Congress take care of it. Page 32. How about letting foreigners be members of Congress? Governor Morris, called the tall boy of the convention, pointed out that if it took 7 years to learn how to be a shoemaker, a foreigner ought to spend 14 years to learn how to be an American legislator. In the end, a senator was required to be a citizen for 9 years, a representative 7 years, and the chief executive or president had to be native born. They made provisions for new states to join the Union and specified how additions or changes to the Constitution could be made in the future. These would be called amendments, but under no circumstances were they to change the type of government that the delegates had created. The delegates didn't want any American dukes or lords suddenly popping up in their society. No title of nobility, they said, shall be granted by the United States. Page 33. Now, the end was actually in sight, but how should they present the Constitution to the states? Should each state legislature vote on whether it would accept or ratify the Constitution? No, they decided. The state legislators could not be trusted. They would not want to keep their own power in their state. They would want to keep their own power in their state and would vote no. It would be better if each state called its own special convention. Next came the question, how many states had to ratify the Constitution before it became the law of the land? Some delegates wanted all 13 states to ratify, but everyone knew Rhode Island wouldn't do it, and New York was doubtful. So it was agreed that if 9 states ratified, they'd have a nation. Any that didn't ratify would simply not be in the Union. On September 8th, the Constitution was sent to a committee to write it up in final form. 4 days later, a revised and very elegant sounding Constitution was presented to the delegates. "We the people," it began. It was impressive, but it was also scary. Some of the delegates didn't think of themselves as "we the people." It gave them a strange feeling to have created a nation that they didn't really know. All at once, some had last-minute thoughts. They had not included a Bill of Rights, which spelled out the rights of individual persons. It was pointed out. There was no mention of freedom of religion, freedom of speech, trial by jury, all those rights which they cherished and which many states had listed in their state constitutions. Page 34. Madison sighed. There was no need for a Bill of Rights, he said. It was taken for granted that individuals kept all the rights that they had specifically given over to the government, that they didn't specifically give over to the government. Finally, with some changes, the Constitution was sent out to be engrossed on parchment, an official document for the delegates to sign. When it came back, the delegates looked at it in wonder. After all, this was the first time that a people had written down rules to start a nation off from scratch. On paper, the Constitution looked so real that Washington declared it a little short of a miracle. Still, it was not perfect, Benjamin Franklin pointed out. He disagreed with some parts, but then he wasn't perfect either. None of them were, and he was convinced that this was the best that they could do. He hoped the delegates would give their new Constitution a chance. Let them not undo their summer's work, he begged, by carrying their old arguments into the public. Let them stand together. Some members, like Luther Martin, who would not have signed, had already gone home, but there were 42 delegates present on September 17th, and 39 signed. At the last minute, 3 backed out. Elbridge Gerry was one. Without a Bill of Rights, he said, he wouldn't put his name down. Edmund Randolph, whose Virginia plan had actually formed the basis of the Constitution, got cold feet. Perhaps he'd been too hasty. Perhaps he was still too much of a Virginian to be an American, too. Perhaps he should wait to see how the country reacted before he made up his mind. George Mason, also of Virginia, refused to sign. Now, it was up to the country. After so much secrecy, people didn't know what to expect. But once they had read the Constitution, they were quick to take sides. Page 36. Those who were for it called themselves Federalists. Those against were called Anti-Federalists, although the antis said they were the true Federalists, and those in favor of the Constitution should be called Nationalists. It took more than 6 months for the states, one by one, to call their conventions, debate, and vote. Meanwhile, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and another strong Federalist, John Jay, began writing newspaper articles explaining just how the new Constitution would work. They showed how the different branches of government would serve as a check on each other so that no one branch or no one person could become too powerful. Steeped in history, these men understood human nature and the temptations of power. Page 37. They might not expect to make a government absolutely safe from all forms of tyranny, but their object was to create a kind of obstacle game which would keep the government in balance. Indeed, they talked so much of checks and balances that this might describe the kind of game it was. Every bill the House of Representatives passed, for instance, had to go to the Senate for its approval. If it made it through the Senate, then it had to go to the President for his signature. If he did not like the bill, he could veto or refuse to sign it. But the House and the Senate still had another chance. If 2/3 of their members voted for it, then it would pass anyway. A final big check lay in the Supreme Court, which could in the course of legal proceedings decide if a law, even a state law, was constitutional or not. There was a whole network of such checks. Although the president could appoint ambassadors to other countries, judges to the Supreme Court, and a variety of other officers, the Senate had to approve his choices. Any amendment proposed to the Constitution had to be submitted to the states for their approval. Now, how, the Federalists ask, could tyranny slip through such a well-ordered system? Besides, the people themselves had the controlling power. Every 4 years they would be electing their president, and at stated intervals they would also be electing their representatives to Congress. The arguments of the Federalists were so strong and so well written that many people gradually grew used to the idea of becoming a nation. Page 38. But not all. Patrick Henry took one look at the first words of the Constitution and saw red. "We the people," he snorted. Since when had they become a single people? He'd known something hadn't smelled right, and here was this fancy document that was a single stroke wiped out their 13 separate identities. Besides, it didn't say one word about those basic rights that they had fought a war over. Page 39. All over the country, people argued about a Bill of Rights. In Connecticut, Noah Webster, educator and compiler of dictionaries, contended that such a bill would be nonsense. "How could you list all the rights a person had?" he asked. "Would you include the right to go fishing in good weather? The right of people to turn over in bed at night?" But most people were serious about the issue, and many were unhappy. Next week, we'll find out what happens with the Bill of Rights. So this ends our reading for this week.